welcome to our Coaching Connections webinar. And this month we have one of our master coaches, John Boomer Stufflebeam, who is going to be talking about situational leadership. Boomer is very active in the Diversified professional coaching as a coach. He's also a former professional athlete playing in the NFL as a punter. He's a retired Navy admiral, business owner, and his specialty definitely is leadership. So he's going to teach us all about Roslick, and he'll explain that to you as far as crisis response. So Boomer, my good friend Boomer is here. I'll turn it over to you, Boomer.
Thank you, Jim, and welcome everyone. It is a delight to be here. I'm going to put up some slides so that it will be more informative than just listening to me wax poetically here. I was at the Pentagon on active duty working in the Joint Staff at 9/11. And in fact, 93 minutes before that airplane slammed into that phase of the building, that one side of the building, I had been in the Navy Command Center, which was the epicenter of where the nose of that airplane slammed into, where 67 of my colleagues were instantly incinerated. Immediately from that point on, my world changed, but so did everybody else's. And I was tasked to come up with to lead a crisis action team and to use a process for how we would respond. That later, as a process, became very valuable to me as a business owner. And I have used it as a leadership training tool for many since then. So this is not the history of how it came about, but what it is all about. It's a tool that you can use. So when I was asked, how did you do what you did, Boomer? You were given very little guidance, certainly not very many resources, and expected to come up with a very coherent and cogent plan. And it, in fact, was all about leadership. It was about finding the right people that I could bring onto a team and then being able to lead that team at a time and in a way that we could provide what was tasked of us to provide to the Secretary of Defense and the President of the United States for how was the U.S. going to respond to this. So I borrowed from what was then the Joint Publication Manual Joint Planning, which comes in two parts. One is in deliberate planning for how in the joint world we gear up to go to war. And the other is crisis planning for what we do when something just like this happens. It's been developed over many years, and I was very comfortable in using it as a template for what it is that I did. When I retired and started my own consulting business, and it started principally in doing crisis management for companies and executives who found themselves in one kind of a crisis or another, what I realized was I could translate this military process into, I'll call it layman's English language, that would resonate and provide a process, a tool, or if you will, a system to work through a crisis. Now, running behind this, behind the curtain, if you will, are four concepts or four characteristics. One is that we have to be able to produce simplicity. And often things that are extremely complicated not only confuse us, but certainly will the people who answer to us in our leadership roles. And so I was taught early on, if there's anything that you need to start with, it's keep it simple. It also has to be clear, because many times so many things are confusing to us in the complexities of various issues. There is no clarity. And so it is incumbent upon leaders to be able to clarify and make it easy for everyone to understand what it is that's going to have to be done. Then to focus on the right things and not to be distracted by all the day-to-day things or ancillary issues that pop up that will, in fact, complicate or cloud what it is that we're working on. And lastly, the thing that I learned, and I added to this from the personal experience that I had working for the then Secretary of Defense, was challenging the assumptions. Because we all tend to make assumptions about something that we think is complicated, and we make assumptions to simplify it. We make assumptions when we clarify something, and certainly when we focus. But challenging those assumptions and doing it with your team is extremely important. So think of these always in your head: simplify, clarify, focus, and challenge those assumptions, and realize that those are running behind this process that I'm going to talk about now. So this is it. You can call it a tool, you can call it a process, you can call it a system, but whatever you want to call it, it's easy to remember with an acronym: ROSLIC. Say it to yourself 3 times in your head: ROSLIC, ROSLIC, ROSLIC. And in doing that, you're putting your muscle memory to work to be able to remember these letters that stand for the parts of this particular process. Number 1, recognition. Number 2, determining outcome. Number 3, creating the steps that are going to be required to deal with the issue that you discover. The leadership and the leadership team that you have to be able to do this, because as we all know, successful owners, successful leaders can never do it alone. And then to be able to communicate, and I'm going to foot stomp it now and I'll say it again later, it is impossible to over communicate. And then lastly, to work on changing the culture so that things happen on automatic. So here's the process. Here's the tool. Here's the system. And we'll step through each one. So in step 1 of ROSLIC, R, recognize what is the real issue. In the years that I was in the military utilizing this process, and in the years since as a business owner and as a business coach, particularly working with the leadership of owners and leadership as executives in other organizations, one of the things that I have observed is that it is hard for leaders to recognize what is the real issue. Often they get it wrong. And what they focus on are the symptoms. And so it's important to bring to the table, as you're going to work on this, all of those symptoms that are out there, but then asking the questions, focusing on what is complicating this picture, clarifying what it is that we're really trying to find out about. What is the real issue? That becomes the most important thing. And I'm here to tell you that most of the time, especially in a crisis, where emotions take over and cloud judgment, right? 3 things happen in a crisis. You freeze, you fight, you flee, and there's one more, which right now is out of my head. But the point being is that you've got to be able to move and move quickly when something bad happens. And when you aren't prepared to just deal with it because of your experience, you need a tool, you need a process. And you have to start with, and it takes, I would say, the greatest amount of time is focusing on what is the real issue and being able to weed it out from all the symptoms that are brought to a table. Once you've got that real issue, and it's important to be able to find out, well, what's the underlying cause of this issue? What has really caused this to happen? Which means, what is it we're going to work on? So that takes us to the second phase, the outcome. What is it we want this to look like when it's all said and done? The first rule of any crisis is you can never go back to the way it was. And that tends to be the first emotional response of leaders. I wish it was the way it used to be. Or I want to be able to take this back to how it was. And most leaders who come into a horrific or traumatic crisis, the first thing they tend to do is to rely on lawyers. I don't have anything against lawyers. They keep us honest, they keep us straight, they keep us out of trouble. But they're not the ones to point out what is it that we want to have happen. So this is the oil rig that blew up in the Gulf of Mexico in 2009 that killed 19 workers on that oil rig called a Deepwater Horizon. And then it started to spew oil all over the Gulf of Mexico that started to wash up on the beaches and shores. That was going to cause an environmental disaster. And everybody was focused at that time on we got to put out the fire, we got to cap the broken well. Well, that's fine as an objective, but that didn't really solve what was the outcome, because the underlying cause of what caused this accident to happen, what procedures and safety violations must have occurred that allowed this to be able to kill these people and to create this environmental disaster. So the outcome of this for British Petroleum, or BP, was not so much just to put out the fire and cap the oil and then clean up the oil. The bigger issue for an outcome was, how does British Petroleum become recognized as the world's most responsible energy producer on the planet? What do they have to do to create that kind of a vision of an outcome? And I would tell you that that is the second hardest thing for a leader to do. Once we've determined what the root cause of this issue is, now it's to be able to look over that horizon and to see, what do we want this to look like when it's all said and done, and then create that as a desired end state. Once we have those articulated, we need to start to put our team together and deal with how are we going to get from where we are right now to that desired end state, to that outcome. And we have to make sure that whatever we say is backed up by our actions, and vice versa. Because as we all know, particularly for leaders, if your words don't match your actions or vice versa, you lose all credibility. So to maintain credibility, words and actions have to match. So as we know where we are right now, particularly in an emotional crisis due to the trauma that's happening around us, and as we focus on that outcome that we have determined that we want to get to as an end state, how do we reverse engineer from where we are to get to there? And it is the leader's primary responsibility to stay focused on that outcome as the steps are brought to bear. And someone has asked me more than once, well, how do you determine what the steps are going to be? Well, all you have to do is solve the first step, because that tends to inform what the next steps ought to be. And as you continue to develop those steps and you clarify what it is that you're doing, you're focused on what has to happen at the end, and you challenge those assumptions, the next steps reveal themselves as you keep working this up. Nobody can do this by themselves. I mean, there are great leaders. There are individuals who really command their position and can see clearly what needs to be done, but they still can't do it by themselves. I mean, they can issue orders and they can make directives. They can even make policy, but it really is where the team comes in, that leadership is going to be able to not only prop up the pinnacle leaders to make them successful, but to actually deal with that real issue and attain that outcome. So it's terribly important to be able to put together the right team, if you don't already have one, that you know, like, and trust. What oftentimes we call to as our go-to team. To be able to help develop those steps from where you are to where you want to go, put metrics against them so you can measure it, and then regularly visit the progress to see how are we doing. And then everybody needs to know, how are we doing? Where are we at? Are we halfway there? Are we almost there? Napoleon was a wonderful communicator as well as a statesman and a military leader. And I'm not putting this picture up here to equate Napoleon to Boomer, believe me. But he taught me a very important lesson as I studied his techniques of what he did and how he did it. In fact, you can read about this yourself. He had working for him a corporal whose job it was to polish his boots, make sure his uniform was ready, bring his meals to him, steed his horse, bring in the generals for the into the command tent for them to have meetings with. Napoleon's corporal. And so what he learned as he stood up on top of his high ground looking over battlefields was the frustration that he suffered in that these generals were not executing the battle in the way that they put it on their sand tables with their toy soldiers to array and execute the war plan that he had helped direct. So he realized that he must be doing something wrong and says, I must not be getting this right. So he wrote an order and he asked his corporal to read it and tell him what it said. Corporal got the order and just started to read it back to him. Napoleon stopped him and said, no, don't read it to me. Tell me what it says. So the corporal had to digest this for a moment. And he started to repeat what he thought it said. And Napoleon said, that's not correct. He goes, throw that one away. And he wrote a second one and asked him to think about that one. And reportedly, the story goes, same thing happened again. But on the third try, the corporal read back what he thought it said. And Napoleon says, aha, that's it. That's exactly what it's supposed to say. Now make copies and distribute them out to my generals. And he became a very successful general in warfare by utilizing a repetitive communication technique. When I first took command of my very first military squadron, which was in disarray, and I needed to help prepare it to get ready to go to war in about a year or less than a year, one of the things that I started to do was to over communicate what our issue was and where we needed to go and how we were going to go do this. And I needed everybody to get on board, buy into it, and pull on the oars and do it together. After about 3 or 4 months of doing this, where I would meet with the entire squadron in a formation, then would break it down and talk with just the officers and then the chief petty officers, and then go talk to a work center, talk to kids on the deck plate, so to speak. My command master chief, my senior enlisted, my Napoleon's corporal, came to me and said, Skipper, we get it. We're choking on it. We understand what needs to be done. I said, thanks very much, Master Chief. Now I got a question for you. How many people have checked in new to our command in the last 7 days who have not heard me talk about this? And he scratched his chin for a second and said, I think maybe 6 or 7. And I said, okay. And we know we have people leaving, and we know we'll have more people that are coming about. So have we really over communicated? He said, I get your point. We have turnover of people. They haven't heard this yet. And so we'll keep supporting what it is that we need to do so that everybody has enough. Everybody has enough. And if anybody remembers after 9/11, the guy at the Pentagon talking about what we were doing in Afghanistan, that was myself. And I got to a habit after some number of days in the press pool at the Pentagon when reporters would ask a question. And if I wasn't satisfied that I really did answer the question, I would follow it up with the, do you have enough? And oftentimes it invited a little bit of a follow-up question, which is a great communication technique to find out, did they really get it? And as you work through these steps, as you recognize what is the real issue that has to be dealt with, when you come with an outcome, an end state, an objective that you want to achieve from that issue, and you are reverse engineering the steps to get from here to there, and you've got a go-to leadership team that is helping you create more buy-in and therefore more commitment from the people that you lead, and you're communicating in multiple ways all the time and constantly updating, now you've got to push that pedal over the top to change the culture. And how do you know that the right culture has been achieved? Well, the way that I looked at it was when I could go and just walk about within my organization, whatever it was, from that point and on, when I was first a squadron commander to the time I retired as the commander of 6th Fleet, When I walked around and just listened to people describing what it is they were doing, when one team member was informing another team member about here was the issue that we were working on, and I didn't have to say anything about it, I knew we were achieving the right culture. It's when things happen on automatic. As one bright person had mentioned to me, if you're pushing this big boulder up a mountain and you stop too soon, what happens? Oh, it steamrolls you right back over. It comes back on you. But once you break the peak, what does that boulder do? It crests and then starts to go down the hill on the other side. And when it's running down the hill on the other side, you've got a culture that you don't have to tend to. So in summary, as a leadership tool you can use, Roslick, again, say it to yourself in your head, muscle memory 3 times. And you want it to be able to count on your fingers, recognize what is the real issue. Articulate what that outcome is that we need to achieve, recognizing that we can never go back and make it as it was before. We've got to create a series of steps, and we need a leadership team to help develop those steps, and then metrics to determine what progress we're making, and then to report it out. Not just me, but all the leadership team. Communicate, communicate, communicate until we see the culture change.
Thank you, Boomer. That was a great discussion on Roslick, and there it is.